The 1970 Prime Minister's resignation honours were officially announced in the London Gazette of 7 August 1970 and marked the June 1970 electoral defeat of Prime Minister Harold Wilson. Life peers: the RT. Hon. Alice Martha Bacon, CBE, Member of Parliament for Leeds North East 1945 to 1955 and Leeds South East 1955 to 1970. Minister of State, Home Office 1964 to 1967. Minister of State, Department of Education and Science 1967 to 1970. The RT. Hon. Jenny Lee, Member of Parliament for North Lanarkshire 1929 to 1931 and Cannock 1945 to 1970. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Public Building and Works 1964–1965. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Department of Education and Science 1965 to 1967. Minister of State, Department of Education and Science 1967 to 1970. Irene Lloyd White, Member of Parliament for East Flint 1950 to 1970. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Colonial Office 1964 to 1966. Minister of State, Foreign Office 1966–1967. Minister of State, Welsh Office 1967 to 1970. The RT. Hon. George Alfred Brown, Member of Parliament for Belper 1945 to 1970. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries 1947 to 1951. Minister of Works 1951. First Secretary of State and Secretary of State for Economic Affairs 1964 to 1966. Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs 1966 to 1968. The RT. Hon. Harold Davies, Member of Parliament for Leek 1945 to 1970. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Pensions and National Insurance 1964 to 1966 and the Ministry of Social Security 1966–1967. Parliamentary Private Secretary to Harold Wilson. The RT. Hon. John Diamond, Member of Parliament for Manchester Blackley 1945 to 1951 and for Gloucester 1957 to 1970. Chief Secretary to the Treasury 1964 to 1970. The RT. Hon. Anthony Greenwood, Member of Parliament for Hayward and Radcliffe 1946 to 1950 and for Rosendale 1950 to 1970. Secretary of State for the Colonies 1964–1965. Minister of Overseas Development 1965–1966. Minister of Housing and Local Government 1966 to 1970. Julian Ward Snow, Member of Parliament for Portsmouth Central 1945 to 1950 and for Lichfield and Tamworth 1950 to 1970. Vice-Chamberlain of the Household 1945–1946. A Lord Commissioner of the Treasury 1946 to 1950. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Aviation 1966–1967. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Health 1967–1968. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Department of Health and Social Security 1968–1969. Privy Councillors: David Headley Ennals, Member of Parliament for Dover, 1964 to 1970. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Army, 1966–1967. Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Home Office, 1967–1968. Minister of State, Department of Health and Social Security, 1968–1970. Ernest Fernyhough, MP, Member of Parliament for Jarrow since 1947. Parliamentary Private Secretary Harold Wilson, 1964–1967. Parliamentary Secretary, Ministry of Labour, 1967–1968 and Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State, Department of Employment and Productivity, 1968–1969. Knights Bachelor: John Desmond Braley, MC, DL, Chairman, Canning Town Glass Works Limited. Trevor Denby Lloyd Hughes, formerly Chief Information Advisor to the Government. Joseph Keegan, Founder and Chairman of Keegan Textiles Limited. Leslie Morris Lever, Member of Parliament for Manchester Ardwork, 1950–1970. Harry Nicholas OBE, General Secretary of the Labour Party. Kenneth Selby, Chairman, Bath and Portland Group Limited. Joseph Ellis Stone, MRCS, NRCP, General Practitioner. Order of the British Empire. Dames Commander Sarah Elizabeth Barker, formerly National Agent, the Labour Party. Commanders Derek Henry Andrews, Private Secretary to the Prime Minister since 1966. Percy Clark, Director of Publicity, the Labour Party. Marjorie Halls, widow of Michael Halls, Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, 1966–1970. Ronald George Hayward, National Agent, the Labour Party. George Holt, Chief Press Officer, Prime Minister's Office. Marcia Matilda Williams, Private Secretary to Harold Wilson. Officers: George Lewis Gaunt, Committee Clerk, Parliamentary Labour Party. Roger James Daw, Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, 1966–1970. Alfred Richmond, journalist. Miss Beryl Pauline Urquhart, Committee Clerk, Parliamentary Labour Party. Members: Phyllis Edith Burt, Secretary and Personal Assistant, Parliamentary Labour Party. Harry James Fowler, actor. Gordon Charles George Fryer, Inspector, Metropolitan Police. William Henry George Green, formerly head of the Dispatch Department, Transport House. Elizabeth Guy, formerly head of the Bookshop, Transport House. Elsie Helena Sally, formerly head of the Directory Department, Transport House. Ruth Margaret Sharp, Private and Constituency Secretary to James Callaghan. British Empire Medal. Chief Wren Steward Margaret Frances Fenton, formerly Chief Steward at Chequers. Thora Pollard, housekeeper to Harold Wilson and Mary Wilson.